Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Teach Middle East podcast. My name is Lisa Grace. With me today is the founder and first teacher of Cuemath, Mr. Manan Khurma, and he is going to be talking to us about why coding and mathematics skills are essential for all students. We're going to dive into what Cuemath is and why he is on a mission to provide free mathematical and coding skills to millions of students globally. It's a very lofty goal, but I'm sure we're going to learn exactly what's making him have such a big, hairy, audacious goal and how he plans to achieve it.
You are listening to the Teach Middle East podcast, connecting, developing, and empowering educators.
Welcome, Manan.
Thanks a lot, Lisa, and lovely to be here and speaking with you.
It is our pleasure to have you. Please, can you do a little intro for us so we get to know Manan just a little better?
Yeah, absolutely, Lisa. So I'm someone who's loved math since I was a kid. Math is something that always fascinated me, and teaching is also something that I like because both my parents, have been university professors. So as a student at college, I started teaching math to high schoolers who were prepping for various competitive entrance exams that happen in India. And that's how my career started in this space. So this was about 15 years back. And ever since then, math learning and math teaching is what I've been doing. Personally, I've taught more than 10,000 students myself. And Cuemath is something that I started in 2014 with this understanding, with this idea that math is something that most students learn the wrong way. Math is something that kids start learning right from kindergarten onward, but they are taught it in a very bad way, which makes them averse to the subject, which makes them hate it. We've all heard about the math demon. So I wanted to do something about it. And I wanted to build a new curriculum, a new style of learning math that would get kids to see math in the right way. And learn it in the right way and see the beauty of it. Math is all around us. Math underlies everything around us. But kids see math as something that they just do in the classroom and then they just forget about it, right? So I wanted to change that with Cuemath and started this in 2014. And the idea is to teach, hundreds of millions of kids, a completely new way to learn math. So this is what I've been doing for the last 7 years.
I like that. If people have been around Teach Middle East for any time, they know we love math over here. We host the annual Middle East Maths Teachers Conference in Dubai. It's a big, fun maths conference filled with groovy maths teachers, and we have a great time just talking about innovative ways of teaching mathematics. And teachers come from all over the world for the Middle East Maths Teachers Conference. So I'm sure anybody who's listened to our podcast or followed Teach Middle East over the many years, they know that we love math. But we wanted to just check with you, Manan, why is learning mathematical skills so important? I know you started mentioning that maths is everywhere, but why is it so important that the students gain the requisite mathematics skills?
Yeah. So Lisa, if you look around the world today and what's happening around the world, right? If you look at the kind of skills that are becoming more and more valuable, if you look at the jobs that are becoming more valuable today, look at all the buzzwords today, right? Product, data science, artificial intelligence, machine learning. All of these skills have mathematical thinking at their core. These are what I call why jobs, WHY, right? Why jobs, where these jobs actually require you to think deeply, to problem solve, to come up with new ways to solve complex problems and so on. And all of these jobs, all of these skills have mathematical thinking at their core. And on the other hand, you have, a lot of jobs getting outdated, which can now be done by artificial intelligence and so on. And this is a trend that we'll see, continuing to increase, right? So 10 years from now, most of the valuable jobs, most of the valuable skills will require today's children to have a very, very strong mathematical thinking background, right? And this is something we're not prepping them for. As of today, the way we are teaching math to our kids today is still a century-old method. The teacher stands on the blackboard and, she teaches a group of 40 kids who are all bunched together in the same class. Some kids may be ahead of the curve, some kids may be behind the curve. But as all of us educators know, each child is unique, each child is special and requires a very, very specific intervention and a very specific way to learn, right? This is not happening. And when it comes to a skill like math, it becomes a big problem because math is not just a good to have skill, it's a must have skill given how the economy is changing. So I actually think this is a very big problem. I actually think governments around the world should recognize this fact that if their kids are not given a strong math background and in general a strong STEM background, there's a chance they may completely fall behind the curve. And I've actually been saying this for a while now, that math should be a new fundamental right, almost. Our kids should actually be given that very strong grounding, but it's not happening. So the need is very deep, but we're very far from a solution.
That is so true. What are some of the shortfalls you're finding with the mathematics teaching and learning currently, apart from the fact that they're standing at the front of the classroom and teaching to a complete group? But what are some of the shortfalls in skill development that you're seeing in your experience?
I think the biggest problem with math education today is the focus on the focus on facts, formulas, theorems. Kids in today's math classes are expected to learn a variety of results, a variety of facts and formulas and, various kinds of theorems and so on. But they don't really understand the why behind it. They don't really understand how these different concepts are connected. So they may be very good at calculating something, but they may not be able to step back and, figure out how that calculation applies to something in the real world. They may not be able to question the question, right? So to give you a very simple example, most kids, get pretty fluent with addition by, let's say, grade 2 or grade 3. But, if I ask a question like, can you find 3 odd numbers for me that will sum up to 30? Let's say I throw this question at any 5th or 6th grader, like, can you find 3 odd numbers, which will sum to 30? Almost every kid will, kind of start trying out various combinations and, do that for a while, and they'll come up with various sets of numbers and so on. But no kid will realize that this is not even possible, because 3 odd numbers will always sum to an odd number, so the sum of 3 odd numbers can never be equal to 30, right? So this ability to question the question, this ability to figure out, okay, what am I being asked to do? What is the reasoning behind it? That is something that is missing in most kids, and only a fortunate few either get that exposure or have this intrinsic ability already to do that. But most of today's kids are actually taught with a deep focus on the what, the facts, the formulas, the theorems, right? But not the why. So I think that's the biggest problem of mathematical learning, right? So there's this very short and very good book that I recommend all math educators read. It's called A Mathematician's Lament by Paul Lockhart. He was a mathematical researcher turned math teacher now. And he essentially says, imagine a music school that takes in kids at kindergarten and teaches them for 12 long years on how to read and write music. So for 12 long years, kids become experts at reading and writing music, drawing all the symbols and bars and clefs and so on, right? But throughout those 12 years, they never once listened to the music itself, once realized what each note sounds like, right? And he basically makes the point that this is how our kids are learning math. They are learning the symbology of it, the formulas, the theorems, but they don't see the music behind it. They don't see how this applies to the real world. So there's a huge disconnect, and I think that's the real problem.
Wow, I do concur, because I can remember how I learned math. It wasn't fun. Hands up. I'm a languages teacher because my math teacher was rubbish. I'm sorry, that's not true. But the fact is that you do find that children at a certain age get turned off from math. So up until, I would say, they are in grade 3 or 4, little kids love math. And I think it's because it's more hands-on, it's fun. They're counting beads and counting stars and adding things and taking things away, and very hands-on. And then they get to somewhere like grade 3 or 4, and then they start to hate math. What do you think is happening there?
I think through the 12 years of schooling, there are actually 3 or 4 points that I've identified. As I've worked with thousands of students, there are these 3 or 4 points that I've identified where kids actually, build this negative relationship with math. So one of those transition points, as you correctly pointed out, is the grade 2 to grade 3, roughly that kind of transition, because that's the first time when you learn new concepts like, division and fractions and decimals and so on, right? And the style of teaching these new concepts is basically just ask the kid to remember, okay, this is how you add a fraction. So like if you have to add half and 1/4, you essentially just tell them, some weird mumbo jumbo saying, okay, there's this butterfly algorithm and this is how you do it. And kids actually have no understanding of what that even means, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one transition point. Then there's another transition point from grade 5 to grade 6, when algebra comes in for the first time. So 3 plus 4 is okay, but what is 3 plus x? And kids just have a very...
Don't ask me.
Kids have a very hard time kind of saying, okay, numbers were okay, concrete quantities were okay, but suddenly you are using these letters and abstract literals and so on, right? So that's another transition point. Then there are two more such transition points. There's a grade 8 to grade 9, when linear equations, quadratic equations, graphing and things like that come up. And then there's the grade 10 to grade 11, when we have calculus and so on, right? So there is 3 or 4 transition points through the 12 years of schooling. And if these transition points are not handled correctly, and if you don't have good teachers through these transition points, you will most likely build a negative relationship with math. So whenever I meet someone, and you said that you didn't have a good relationship with math, right? I always tell them it is not your fault. It is the way you were taught. It's not anything to do with your intrinsic ability. Every human is naturally wired to be great at math. We are mathematical thinkers in terms of how our brains have evolved, right? But it's just the way we are taught that we kind of build this aversion to the subject, right? So let me give an example, right? Exponents is a grade 6, grade 7 concept, depending on which country you're in, right? The way kids are taught exponents is, okay, here's a bunch of formulas, here's a bunch of drills, and, you keep practicing and so on, and hopefully you build some understanding of it, right? But in the context of how we do it at Cuemath, we actually get our kids to understand exponential behavior in real world context, like COVID-19, for example, right? If one person infects 2 people and those 2 infect 2 more each and so on and so forth, right? That's exponential behavior. Mm-hmm. So even 3rd or 4th graders at Cuemath will actually draw binary trees and figure out, okay, this becomes a geometric progression. 1 becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16 and so on. And suddenly you have this explosive growth of the virus, right? And our 3rd and 4th graders have this intrinsic understanding of exponential behavior to the extent that some of them have gone back to their parents and said, hey, why are you not wearing a mask? Or, why are you not social distancing? You're actually spreading, COVID exponentially and so on. So when you teach kids mathematical concepts in the context of what's happening around them, they make these connections beautifully, and they just kind of internalize them deeply. But we don't do that because it's effortful. It's hard, right? And the legacy system of the last centuries, still continues, and I think will continue for the next many decades.
Gosh, don't tell me you think it's going to continue.
It's a system of huge inertia, and it's very, very hard to change.
I can imagine.
Happen, yeah.
Wow. But what makes you want to solve this problem?
I think it's one of the biggest problems to be solved out there today. Obviously there's the personal passion aspect of it. I love math, and I don't consider myself as having any special gift for the subject. I was just fortunate enough to be exposed to math the right way from a very young age, good books, good teachers, my parents were university professors, as I said. So I had that, strong, good initial exposure. I think, that can be passed on to, all kids. But I think the much bigger driver of, why I'm doing this is what I said, right? I think 10 to 15 years from now, we are just going to see this very, very different world where conventional jobs and conventional skills have become completely outdated, and the people who will thrive in that economy, in that setup, will be people who are complex problem solvers, who have these problem solving skills. If you look at the World Economic Forum report, for the last many years, this is what they've been saying, essentially, that the top skill of today is complex problem solving. So they come out with this list of 10 skills. And on that list, I think for the last few years, the top skill always has been complex problem solving, because you don't know how the world is going to look like, right? I mean, AI is on the rise. A lot of highly valuable skills also are now being done better by AI. So in such a world, what do you do, right? So hopefully new careers and new jobs will be created. I'm not a pessimist in that sense, but our kids today are best prepped for that world if they have that strong, mathematical thinking and problem solving background. And, this is a problem at a scale of 1 billion learners. 1 billion kids across the world need to learn math. So it's a big problem. It's an exciting problem. It's a problem that the world needs, to be addressed and solved. So that's what excites me about it.
Yeah, it does sound like a big, big problem to solve. But I tell you what, all problems, big or small, they need passionate people behind them who are really driving the solutions. So that's going to lead me into talking to you about coding, because coding is also a skill that is on the rise and is in demand. And our children need to now have the language of coding the same way they have a second language. Can you tell me what is driving this need for more coding skills?
Yeah, I think I have a bit of a nuanced point of view here. So let me talk about that a little bit. I've done a lot of coding in my college days and after that. And I actually started learning coding in my school days, actually. But I tend to think of coding as an extension of math, because at the heart of coding is mathematical thinking again. That's why we are Cuemath, but we still do, coding because, coding for us is an extension of math. It's a part of mathematical thinking, right? I think if coding is taught the right way, which essentially means that kids understand the basic constructs, the basic primitives of coding, data structures, loops, if else conditionals, and all the basic concepts of coding. If they do it well, then they can become very powerful coders, regardless of what language they pick up to learn in. But I see a lot of coding classes today that focus on just a superficial, of kids to the subject. And I think that's not great, because ultimately, kids won't end up learning anything deeply. So I think if you have to teach coding to kids, you have to do it the right way. You have to do it with a focus on mastery. But if you do it well, and if a kid actually picks up, coding skills, they are going to do really, really well, when they grow, because coding as a skill is only going to grow, is only going to become more and more valuable, programming in general. And computational thinking, just like there's math, but there's a broader mathematical thinking, you have coding and you have a broader computational thinking. Can you actually think in terms of algorithms and, sequencing of instructions and so on, right? So if you focus on that, I think that's the right way to teach coding. But in recent times, especially in India, you've seen this huge kind of demand for coding, and partly it's a wave, but I think a lot of that interest is here to stay.
Yeah. I wonder, what's the earliest age that we can start our children on coding?
At Cuemath, our kids start learning coding as young as grade 1, which is about 6 years. But for that segment of students, the focus is more on what we call visual coding, which is block-based coding. So essentially, for example, if you have to take an object, let's say from point A to point B, and there's a bunch of instructions, that you've been given, you just have to order them correctly so that the object moves from point A to point B, right? So it's very visual. Even young kids can pick it up quickly. But as we progress through grades, right? So middle schoolers are taught app development skills like JavaScript and so on. And then senior graders are taught Python. And then we even have, some basic exposure to machine learning and artificial intelligence and so on. So it depends on grades, but essentially you can start teaching coding and computational thinking right from grade 1 onward. The best speakers of a language are generally those people who started speaking it very early on in their lives, right? That's why native speakers of a language are so good, right? They started speaking it or listening to it at least, when they were really, really young. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with coding. Coding is like a language. It's a style of thinking. It's a way of thinking. And if you immerse the kid when they're very young into that language, they'll pick it up very fluently. But it will become harder and harder as you grow up, right? So for a 25-year-old to pick up coding for the first time is going to be far harder than an 8-year-old kid doing coding, right. And then actually, because it's the power of compounding, right? It's what I call the most powerful force in the universe. If you start early and you keep at it, the compounding gains are very high.
Yeah, I do agree. So when they're starting, you're saying they start with visual coding and then they move on. Is there a coding language that's more important than others? I hear Java, HTML, Python. Is there one that's more important?
No, I think, as I said, the language in which you're coding is actually secondary. I think the focus, the importance is more about the fundamentals of programming, right? The basics of programming, like, conditionals and loops and data structures and so on, right? So no matter what language you pick up, if you teach these concepts well, the kid is going to do well at programming. But that said, I do believe that one of the best text-based coding languages for new students or for new coders to pick up for the first time is Python. It's a very easy language to learn, huge amounts of documentation available. And I have actually encouraged a lot of adults also to kind of, pick up Python for the first time and who've now become fluent at it. So the choice of the language in which you're coding is secondary. I think the focus on the programming fundamentals is far more important.
Yeah. So this huge, hairy, audacious goal that you have of getting millions of students to improve their mathematical and their coding skills, you plan to do this via Cuemath. Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit more about Cuemath and what you guys do there?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, I started Cuemath in 2014. So it's been over 7 years now. And we do a bunch of things at Cuemath. Our main flagship kind of offering is the live classes that we offer with expert teachers who run math and coding classes, for kids from across the world. So we do all grades starting from kindergarten all the way to grade 12. So that's 13 years of schooling. And we have programs in math and in coding, for all grades and all geographies actually. So in the Middle East, for example, we have different curricular versions that cater to the Middle East schools. In the US, we have the Common Core. In the UK, we have GCSE and so on and so forth. So we have students from all over the world. As of today, we have more than 100,000 students on the platform who are doing math and coding classes with us. And we have a network of more than 10,000 tutors who are, carefully selected and handpicked and then trained to become Cuemath teachers, and they follow a very, very specific style of teaching. That's part of what we call the Cuemath method. So for example, one of the aspects of the Cuemath method is that if a child is stuck on a problem and needs help, the teacher is never supposed to give away the answer directly. She's supposed to give the student small hints and nudges, what we call cues. So the teacher is supposed to give cues to the student, but the student is supposed to discover the final answer on their own. And this cues is the reason why we're called Cuemath, by the way. That cue in Cuemath has a very special meaning, right? So the reason we do this is because when a child discovers an answer on their own, their retention is far, far higher. So we have a lot of these different aspects of the Cuemath method that create a very powerful and holistic learning experience around math and coding. And our teachers right now, they're all based in India, but at some point, we will look at recruiting teachers from outside India as well, in the Middle East and in other countries as well. But student side market is obviously global, and we have students coming from all over the world. So this is the live class part of it. But we also, given we call it the 1 billion math minds mission. So we want to create 1 billion math minds. So as part of that mission, we also put out a lot of free content on our website, on our platform, on our app, that kids can, access for free and hopefully, get better at some aspects of their math learning. So we also do a lot of that.
Yeah. And you have an ambition of, is it to get 1 million students free math and coding tuition? Tell me about that mission. Maybe I don't have the number right. You tell me about the mission.
Yeah, so ultimately our goal, as I said, is to create 1 billion math minds. 1 billion is a big number. It's about 14-15% of the global population. So the thinking there is essentially 1 billion kids across the world need to learn math and hopefully need to learn coding as well. And, can we touch all these kids in some way or the other through our free courses and free content offering, right? So that's the broader mission. And as part of that, we also expect ultimately millions of kids to be part of our live class ecosystem where they are actually taught by expert teachers on how to do math better, how to do coding better, and so on. So that's the for-profit part of the business. Kids actually sign up for these classes with these expert tutors and, but through our free content and curriculum ecosystem, we hope to touch 1 billion students over the course of the company's existence.
Right. And you said you have this live component to your teaching. How does that work? Is it happening simultaneously at different time zones? Because I'm thinking, a child in the United States, they obviously need to get the classes during that time zone. How is it working?
So let's say you are in the UAE and you are a grade 4 student and you sign up for our math classes. So we'll handpick a teacher for you. We'll map you to that teacher basis your background and your current proficiency level and a bunch of other things. And then you will be expected to attend regular classes with this teacher, but the classes will be 1-to-1. And there'll be 8 classes in a month. Each class will be 1 hour long. So that's 2 classes in a week. And in each class, you will follow a very carefully curated set of materials that you have to work on, worksheets and a bunch of other things, activities and so on. We also have a lot of simulations and games that we built into the curriculum. And as you're doing that in each class, the teacher is monitoring each and every step that you're doing. And as in when you need help, the teacher steps in, talks to you in a 1-to-1 audio video call that's inbuilt into the platform itself. And you keep making progress and your parents will, be constantly updated on what you're doing in the class. So it's a fairly simple system, but a very powerful system because the way we have designed the curriculum and the way our teacher teaches, as I said, is very special and very powerful.
Amazing. So when you have, for example, asynchronous classes, and then you also have these live classes, do you find that the students who take the live classes perform better than the ones who are in the asynchronous route of learning coding and math?
So in general, for kids from across the world, we generally do only 1-to-1 and we don't do, large one-to-many kind of formats because those we find to be not too effective because different kids, as I said earlier, require different interventions from the teachers and so on. So we do these 1-to-1 classes, but then we also have lots of students who are actually just using a curriculum or our app for free and, they're not really part of the live classes. Obviously, we find that learning outcomes for students who have signed up for our live classes are far better, far more deeper compared to students who just access a curriculum through it. And the reason is obvious, right? So if you sign up for a gym, but you just go there on your own versus if you get a coach to kind of work out with you every time you go there, right? The outcomes are just extremely different. So that's what happened when you do math or coding with our expert teachers in live classes, it just changes the order of the outcomes. Yeah.
What kind of equipment do the students need, the ones who are doing your live, especially your coding classes? What kind of equipment do you recommend?
Actually, they just need a laptop and a good internet connection and headphones. So it's fairly simple. Laptop or desktop suffices, and they don't need any special equipment. On the teacher side, obviously, there's some bit of additional paraphernalia that she requires, but on the student side, it's actually fairly simple. So as I said, we have students from all across the world, accessing these classes on all kinds of devices. So it's actually pretty simple.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm very, very curious because I have 2 9-year-olds, boys, and I want to get them into coding. They're interested. And I think I would prefer live classes where they have someone there just in case they run into any difficulties with the work. They could have someone to ask for a cue. See how I did that there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you should definitely give a try to Cuemath then.
Yes, I think I should have a try and see how it works for them. So when you think of the future and you look at globally what's happening, what do you think is going to happen moving forward as it relates to children's education? What do you see in your little crystal ball, wherever you are?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a complex question and complex issue actually. And I actually see, on the one side, these schooling systems that, as I said, legacy, systems of schooling and so on and learning, I don't foresee them changing too much, actually, given, I've interacted with, lots of stakeholders in the schooling ecosystem and so on. I think it's very hard to change a system that has so much inertia. Obviously, like you have lots of good teachers and lots of, individual schools that are trying to do, great things on their own. But if you look at the macro kind of picture, right? So India has, hundreds of thousands of schools and millions of students, for example. But I don't foresee a major disruption happening to how they have been learning or how they will learn, in the future. So that's one side of it, which is essentially that the schooling system itself may not evolve too much. But then on the other side, you have all of these new awesome solutions coming up that are direct to consumer. Like, for example, in the case of Cuemath, right? So we are reaching to end user, which is, students, K-12 students and their parents. We're reaching out to them directly. And then you have lots of other such solutions coming up as well, right? So whether that's self-serve apps or products or whether that's live classes like ours and so on, right? So you have a lot of these solutions coming up. And I think some of them are going to scale massively and they are going to create a lot of value. So I actually foresee a scenario where schooling will continue more or less as is, and schooling will evolve from primarily an education focused kind of objective to more, socializing for the kid and, making friends and so on. So schooling will kind of evolve more and more into that. While for deep learning, you'll have these outside school kind of solutions and platforms coming up and parents kind of opting for a mix, right? So sending the kids to school, but also opting for some of these, after school, beyond school kind of systems. Obviously, in the ideal world, I would have liked the school itself to solve for everything, right? So because if a kid is going there for 7 or 8 hours in a day, ideally the school should take care of everything, all learning needs of the child at least. But I don't foresee that happening. And I actually think you will have lots of good solutions outside of school come up. The flip side of that is, inequality in terms of access might actually increase, where you have a set of parents and students who can afford to pay high price points, get the best tutors themselves and purchase the best platforms or learning solutions. But then you have, other sets of students who can't do that. So there's a potential for that inequality to widen further. But even on that front, I think, including us, a lot of players are actually doing a lot of good work in terms of putting out content for free, curriculum for free that kids can access, bridging that gap. But that's definitely something, that remains to be seen how that will pan out.
Brilliant. Thank you. Manan, I think that is a good place, for us to wrap up the podcast. How can people connect with you and learn more about Cuemath?
So one is our website, cuemath.com. That's cuemath.com, on which all the work that we do is kind of cataloged and indexed. And we talk a lot about it on our blog as well, that you can find on the website. Then there's my personal profile on LinkedIn. People can search me on LinkedIn and I do make posts now and then. And would be happy to connect with any listener or viewer, who wants to discuss something or has a point of view or a suggestion or input.
Brilliant. Thank you so very much for being on the Teach Middle East podcast.
Thank you, Lisa. It was lovely speaking with you.
Thank you for listening to the Teach Middle East podcast. Visit our website, teachmiddleeast.com, and follow us on social media. The links are in the show notes.